Today's focus is that Tesla's battery day destroys the plans in global manufacturing for large numbers of companies is a focus of our discussion for today. This is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Thanks once again for joining us. We want to thank our subscribers. We also want to note that this show is made possible by a large group of Patreon supporters. And if you enjoy the show and would like more information on investing and trading better in Tesla and other stocks, please take time to come over and support us on Patreon. So right now we're in a place called the Inner Harbor. We're in our MGM casino. We'll show you more of our nature footage here as the show at the end of the show today. As part of reviewing Battery Day, I had an opportunity to do about an hour-long interview with one of our PhD friends of the show. We kind of went back and forth, and the idea I had was to actually wear a hat when John's comments were coming through versus my questions. So there are probably 4 or 5 things that we covered that I think were substantive that were worth review in a conversation. The first of those items was, I don't know if you noticed it, but several companies in Asia lost value on their stocks as soon as Elon announced what he was doing relative to Battery Day and actually building a test facility for batteries that'll be ready in 2 years. So this was actually strange to me because my initial reaction upon seeing the fact that he's building a 10 gigawatt facility on Cato Road near the current factory in Fremont was, well, it's a good idea to have a test factory to refine and define these new batteries. But on the other hand, the data didn't kind of make sense. Producing 2,000 battery or 10,000 batteries is great, but if your car takes up 3,000 cells per car, in theory, 10,000 doesn't necessarily get you that far. Maybe you have 4 or 5 cars worth of production that's been completed. So my thought process on it was, that sounds like a real waste of time that they're doing this. I also had other thoughts about this that I reviewed with our advisor that I thought you might find interesting, the back and forth. So among my arguments was, number one, I was really disappointed by Battery Day that it was even being done, because every bit of information that comes out of it sort of drives into the marketplace and affects competitors in terms of how they're doing things, and it saves them a lot of money and time having to figure it out and then do it. So one of the biggest things that was a battle for me with our advisor was I said to him, there's an overall trend in Silicon Valley in terms of manufacturing. For example, in the case of Apple, there's a company called TSMC, and they have fabs in South Korea. Apple's producing 75,000 or 75 million phones right now in preparation for its latest rollout. The problem that goes on with this rollout is the fact that nobody can get down to the level TSMC is or the scale. So Apple literally rents their fab for about 3 months, maybe even 4, and nobody else can produce there during that time period. So the iPhones are produced there in terms of core technology of chips, and then it's blended with other chips from others and put together in China. Well, there's been a trend in Silicon Valley over the last 30 years where we used to produce or build fabs and then build a lot of these. And then it was realized that the problem with building a fab was that if you build a building $2 to $5 billion and the technology being produced there is short-lived, 2 or 3 years, you end up potentially with huge losses once, if you're unable to fill up the production space over time. And so what's kind of happened over time is when it comes to putting buildings like that up, people in the US were like, look, we'll let the quasi-governmental entities in Korea or Taiwan or China produce these, and on the back end, you have government taking on the risk of this not working out, But, but those entities do get the advancement in technology that's associated with actually doing this heavy duty manufacturing. So what it's done is sort of caused people like Apple, for example, to capture a lot of the profit, but ship a lot of the risk off to entities that are putting these facilities up. So as soon as I saw that Elon was building a facility on Cato Road and what it was going to do, I was like, oh no, he's bringing manufacturing back on shore in a way that has been really shipped offshore for a lot of good reasons. And not only is it coming onshore, but it's coming onshore out of Tesla's pocket rather than splitting the burden with a Panasonic or another manufacturer. So my take on this was, oh no, I'm worried about how the company's going to do if they're pouring cash and manpower into this versus, let's say, building some of the new vehicles that haven't shown up yet. So what was interesting about this, we talked with our advisor, John, and he made a comment to me. He said, well, the factory isn't going to be that huge to begin with, number one. But number two, you have to think about cost of goods sold. Meaning that one of the things that's going on right now is there's been a stair-step process. Everybody was buying LG batteries and shipping them from Korea to their production facilities in the United States. What's happened is we've had a transition to now GM and others are in partnership with LG, be it LG's building facilities in Poland. In the case of General Motors in Ohio is where their LG partnered facility is being built. So the logic of the auto industry was, let's go vertical, non-vertical integration. So for example, GM was 25% vertically integrated. And so the logic was, the less vertically integrated we are, you get the benefit of spreading costs out across a number of suppliers. But one of the key benefits was that if you have 2,000 parts like an ICE vehicle, in theory, by using many suppliers, those individual suppliers could generate lower costs, but they could also do the R&D necessary to push forward faster than if you were asking one company to handle all 2,000 parts by itself. So that's the ICE logic of production. In the case of EVs, when you're running 17 moving parts, different party. So now, the whole idea that Bob Lutz and GM had used was that they were planning on simply buying batteries, and then batteries would become a commodity, and Tesla owning its own production facility would become an anvil around its neck. We all know how that party has actually played, which is instead of it becoming an anvil around Tesla's neck that was predicted, you now have all these other entities that have begun building their own battery facilities to replicate what Tesla's done. The question is, why is that? The answer is that it turns out that, let's say when you buy a battery from Korea, the margin is 20% markup by whoever the partner might be. Let's call it LG. Now the next logic would be, what happens when you bring batteries onshore and you share the cost of the factory with LG? They still need to make money, so let's theoretically say, instead of paying 20%, because we're splitting the cost, our margins are 10% on those batteries. The problem that pops up is, if Tesla actually goes ahead with the plan of building its first sort of test facility ready in 2 or 3 years, there creates this problem of, you tried to make the transition to co-production like Tesla did as a way to cut down or improve the profit margins so you can compete. Well, now if Tesla is choosing to go on its own and produce, there's that 10% margin now that's a competitive disadvantage that competing firms can't make up for in those joint ventures. So basically his argument, and I'd have to agree with it, is the reason why the stock prices of, I guess, LG, Cattle, and others fell upon this news from Elon was, well, wait a second, if Tesla decides to go on its own to produce its own batteries, in order to compete, the Daimler-Benz as well as the GMs of the world are going to have to do the same. because eventually they're going to have to go toe-to-toe with Tesla, and they don't have the advantage of all the profits from ICE vehicles being brought over, and they could just lose money on electric vehicles on a regular basis. So I have to admit, I totally disagreed. I thought it was nuts for Tesla to go on its own, given the great partnership with Panasonic that they have and then the other partners they have. But the issue is that if their batteries are doing well, Tesla can bring that money in-house. And once it comes in-house, it becomes a way for them to have a price competitive advantage over other firms. So I have to say that I was against the whole idea, but when you look at it from that perspective, I have to say that, hey, that kind of makes sense. Elon articulated that his real goal was, can we get that car down to 25K and still make our margins? And his hunting for a legitimate sort of market priced vehicle of that sort is actually a great idea, but it turns out that one of the ways he's getting there is by wiping out suppliers that might be supplying them and turning them into, they could be partners in some way, but in theory, they have to go that route. So again, the reason why CATL and LG's battery or stock price fell is that if competing companies now have to carefully study Elon's plan, and he gave it very detailed, they actually saved 2 or 3 years from perhaps joining and going down the partnership route. And they might in fact choose to reroute how they're gonna compete in the future by eliminating that partner, by simply having the facility built, because they will have to deal with Tesla. And this highlights one of the main reasons why I thought Battery Day was a horrible idea. If in fact Elon has said nothing, we're 2 years down the road and they said, aha, we're building our own batteries. Now you'd have the problem for competing firms of having 2 or 3 years away from having their own facilities. Instead, you now have them completely redoing their plans because they have to be ready to compete with Tesla toe-to-toe eventually. And this just saves them a whole bunch of time in doing so, which is why I thought this was a horrible, among a bunch of other reasons, why I thought this was a really, really bad idea. So we kind of went through a large number of other questions. Another one that I thought was interesting that we sort of battled on was that I was of the opinion that one of the discussions is what happens if we make the transition to solid state. And what he said was, yes, you have a big building, yes, you have processes there, but the thing about it is, if you wanted to transition to another technology, you're not in that bad a shape. You can actually get it done within that building if a new technology replaced the lithium-ion process that we're working with right now. So I thought it was good to hear. A couple of other sort of minor items was the fact that operating in Silicon Valley is one of the highest cost production facilities in the world. Global manufacturing typically chases low land prices as well as low labor costs. And China was it for a while, it moved to Vietnam, but it turns out that China is building a number of they've built their own sort of technology office parks in different parts of Africa. And now you have Chinese suppliers going there for the cheap land and manpower they need in order to build products competitively around the world and ship. In addition, Africa hasn't caught up in the environmental planning process. And so they're obviously getting away with, let's say, polluting in ways that they might now in Africa that's no longer allowed in China. So all of these methods are actually reducing their costs, hence an African move. So, doing production inside of Silicon Valley right next to the plant actually kind of seems high cost, but it is a smaller facility at 10 gigawatt hours. And in theory, if this works well, they can take the lessons learned and move them off next to all the other manufacturing facilities they're building around the world. So it is in fact somewhat of a test case, but we could actually see that test case expanding to other locations in the process. So I have to admit, I was very surprised at some of the answers, conclusions that were shared. relative to what Tesla is doing in terms of batteries. I do believe that, we do have a big change going on in terms of how the global OEMs are going to compete with Tesla. I have to admit, at the back of my mind, I kept thinking about when GM first started. I had a chance to fly. I was flying into or routed through Detroit and sat next to a lady who was part of the translation group from Korea who was helping translate the manuals for their batteries so that the engineers at GM could utilize those as part of executing their electric vehicles. And so I really thought, after I listened to him, that the whole logic that GM was using was good, because sort of the leaders in production of lithium-ion batteries was from Korea. They've been doing it a long time, and it made more sense to sort of leverage their core competency than try to develop one yourself and deliver a product at the same time. And so it'll be interesting to see what the new announcements are coming out of Germany, Detroit, and other locations, now that we have Tesla making this change to its own battery production facilities. So overall, I would say that his analysis was the decisions made by Elon and Tesla relative to its own production and trying to get to the bleeding edge is actually a really good idea. You get out there, you move the needle in terms of what's going on in the technology relative to lowering costs. You also benefit from increasing the vertical integration to include your batteries, because you now don't have to pay outside suppliers and you control the growth of supply of batteries. So, as I go through it, even though I was averse to the battery day, I really like the idea of the company now beginning to produce small number of its batteries. The other thing I have to admit I like about the factory is one of the things we've been calling for a long time is, when is it that Tesla was going to start producing its own batteries to support the fact that as we head down the road, we're going to have specialty batteries that are needed relative to specialty functions. So there might be an 8 to 10% shift or a 20% shift in battery configuration and power output if we're in a heavy construction situation or a heavy truck situation, versus if we're trying to generate a lot of speed all the time and use, in essence, ludicrous mode to actually do this. So I think that I have to admit that this show is I've been corrected. And I think that I've been corrected in that I think we're going to now see, because of Tesla, more joint ventures. But beyond the joint ventures, I really think we're going to start seeing the decision made to develop core competencies internally for the large auto companies. And I think this shapes the future very differently than what one might have expected. I guess the only other final note that I wanted to share that everybody's heard about is the Nikola story keeps unraveling. The latest round of that is Tesla's announcement that they're in a lawsuit with Nikola regarding the external of the semi-truck. And in theory, I guess this might affect why the truck might be delayed. But the reality is that Nikola stole the designs from another company and then patented them, and it should not have been given a patent to begin with, is where we are in that patent lawsuit. We'll see how this plays out in terms of news that we get here in the near future. I wanted to finish up now on our Tesla discussion for the day and lessons learned from our PhD advisor, John, and move over to our health tips. Wanted to remind you, 25 leg lifts while seated with ankle weights on is a great idea on a daily basis to strengthen the quad muscles, limiting potential for knee issues. Number 2, a 30 SPF or F or greater as a way to prevent skin cancer. Number 3 is to make a point of not eating more than once a week fried foods. Number 4 is I'd like to, people have been talking about it, but I still think it's a great idea. It turns out that blood flow through the body impacts many things. So for example, if you eat a large meal and then you get home and decide lovemaking is your plan, it sounds like a really good idea to have the large meal, but the problem is that if you have blood flow heavily to digesting that food, that blood flow is not available to support your lovemaking activities. So I wanted to highly encourage you to consider this, because the recommendation from our urology PhD is that you eat a small meal, maybe a salad, and then see whether or not you don't have more enjoyment from the fact that your body doesn't have to digest that heavy meal, and at the same time use blood flow for other things. So you might want to try it out. I'm looking forward to what you guys have said based on this. I have to admit, I've somewhat tested the logic, and it really works. So I highly recommend you consider it as well. The final item on our list today, I would say, is encouraging you to consider the 5-2 or one of the other diets relative to basically brain functions work better if you introduce some fasting activities. And so I think that would be the last item that we would put on the list of things to consider. Any rate, this is Greg for Teslafaninsight. Tschüss German, au revoir French, Rot, Hebrew, Hoda, Hafez, Farsi. Assalamu alaikum, Muslim, Namaste, I think Hindu, Ni hao ma, hello in Chinese, Zdravstvuyte, hello in Russian, and Hey do, Swedish. And in Jamaica, we say, Nuff respect, walk Woodman. Thanks for joining us. And we're gonna, I really enjoy this area, and the views are terrific. And so even though our show's done, I have said that I'm gonna start including stuff that I like to once we're in the zone where we're not violating any rules about Tesla discussion in terms of process. And so I'm just gonna give maybe a minute or so to enjoy the beautiful landscape of ducks and water that's here in Maryland's Inner Harbor. Notice the calm water. I see MGM Casino behind us. So one of my favorite things is to see the clouds above being reflected in the water. Is a really great exposure. Thanks for joining us, and have a great day.